Foreign Policy, Bethany Scout and Shalia, explaining the similarities and differences in attitudes about the nation's proper role in the war during the time between World War I and World War II.
How interwar foreign policy played a part in World War II. In the interwar period, the United States, however, did not retreat into complete isolation. The necessities of commercial growth dictated continued government support for overseas private investment. That in turn drove the United States to further engage both with Latin America and the rebuilding of Europe in the 1920s. The United States also played important roles in both international negotiations to set arms limitations and the creation of pacts that aimed at securing a lasting peace. By the mid-1920s, however, a general feeling of economic uncertainty reinforced isolationist tendencies and encouraged new legislation that placed severe limits on immigration to the United States, particularly from Asia. During the 1930s, the rise of fascism as a threat to international peace sparked concern in the United States, but the Great Depression correlated U.S. willingness to act. In this environment, keeping the nation out of the brewing tension in Europe and Asia became an important foreign policy goal. Relationships between America and Germany. The main institution intended to bring peace and stability and resolve disputes was League of Nations, created in 1919. The League was weakened by the non-participation of the United States, Germany, and the Soviet Union, as well as later of Japan. It could not handle the refusal of major countries, especially Japan and Italy, to accept adverse decisions. Historians agree it was ineffective in major disputes. A series of international crises strained the League to its limits, the earliest being the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Japan was censored and quite the League. This was soon followed by the Absian Crisis of 1934 to 1936, in which Italy invaded Ethiopia, one of the independent African nations. The League tried to enforce economic sanctions on Italy, but to no avail. The incident highlighted French and British weaknesses, exemplified by their reluctance to annihilate Italy and lose it as a counterweight against Hitler's Germany. The limited actions taken by the Western powers pushed Mussolini's Italy towards alliances with Hitler's Germany. The Obsidian War showed the world how ineffective the League was at solving disputes. It played no role in dealing with the Spanish Civil War. The League also could not resolve other smaller conflicts involving major European nations, such as the Rif War between Spanish and Morocco separatists.
The Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 resulted from a proffer drafted by the United States and France that, in effect, outlawed war to resolve disputes or conflicts, or however nature, of whatever origin they may be, which may rise among them. Most nations readily signed up and used the occasion to promote the goal of peaceful foreign policies. The only issue was the actual formula of the something of all wars. The French wanted to define restricted to wars of aggression, while the French wanted to while the Americans insisted it should include all kinds of warfare. Historian Harold Jefferson notes that the pact has been ridiculed for its moralism and legalism, the lack of influence on foreign policy. He argues that it has instead led to a more activist American foreign policy. Its central provisions renouncing the use of war and promoting peaceful settlement of disputes and the use of collective force to prevent aggression were more incorporated into the UN Charter and other treaties. Although civil wars continued, was between established states have been rare since 1945, with a few exceptions in the Middle East. In the interwar period, the diplomatic role of an official protecting power was formalized in the Geneva Convention of 1929. Protecting powers were allowed to inspect prisoner of war camps, interview prisoners in private, communicate freely with prisoners, and
supply books for the prison library. However, a suggestion by the International Committee of the Red Cross that it was made to be responsible for ensuring compliance with the treaty was rejected. Lend-Lease Act Program. Passed on March 11, 1941, this act set up a system that would allow the United States to lend or lease war supplies to any nation deemed vital to the defense of the United States. Lend-Lease, as Roosevelt's plan became known, ran into strong opposition among isolationists, members of Congress, as well as those who believed the policy gave the president himself too much power. During the debate over the bill, which continued for 2 months, Roosevelt's administration and supporters in Congress argued convincingly that providing aid to allies like Great Britain was a military necessity for the United States. In fact, through the end of the World War II, the United States would use it to provide a total of some $50 billion in aid, equal to $690 billion in 2020 dollars, to more than 30 nations around the globe, from the Free French movement led by Charles de Gaulle and the governments in exile of Poland, the Netherlands, and Norway, to Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, Paraguay, and Peru.
Okay, some similarities in interwar foreign policy between World War II and World War I is that they decided to join the worlds after another country made some move on them. For World War I, it was Germany, and World War II was Japan at Pearl Harbor. There was conflict on whether or not to join, and each time people were going for isolation and for intervention on both ways. There was a lot of conflict within the country. For both of them, increased manufacturing industrialization happened because they needed to gain supplies for the war, and that helped jobs and the economics in America itself. They joined late compared to other countries for both wars, as they only joined once it happened for them and for their own benefit and not for anyone else's. After both of them, they ended up joining something to help, and they joined nations wide pacts like the League of Nations and the United Nations. The League of Nations was after World War I, and the United Nations was after World War II, and they both were to help prevent future wars and conflict and try to resolve things quicker and faster. Some differences in interwar foreign policy between World War I and World War II is they had a more greater reason to join World War II, and more people were supporting it because their own nation was attacked at Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, and their own people died. In World War I, they were more going towards isolation afterwards. World War II, after the war, got more involved with other countries, and they really focused on communism and containing that, with next the Cold War and the Soviet Union. The Cold War was also a effect after the World War II, and that just shows the differences on how people's perspectives changed after each war. Another difference is in World War II, there was discrimination within its own nation, as we were very against anyone of Japanese race, and ourselves were very discriminatory to them. Some interwar foreign policies leading up to World War I. There was a lot of disagreement within the nation on whether or not to join. We thought it would end the peace and the era of Reconstruction. President Woodrow Wilson had a strict impartial neutrality, but that quickly changed when Germany violated its pledge to suspend unrestricted submarine warfare in the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean, as well as their attempts to entice Mexico into an alliance against the United States, and he saw that as a fair enough reason to disregard his impartial neutrality and join. When they joined the Allied powers, the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, against Germany and Austria. President Woodrow Wilson went before a joint session of Congress to get the appealed to be able to join the war. U.S. led Allied forces over Germany and Austria, and we turned the tide to win the war. After World War One, the economics changed and they were looking up. There was jobs and more manufacturing wages increased consumer buying power, which helped the economy. Unemployment declined from 7.9% to 1.4%, and this boom faded quickly though. And as a result of that, with the combination of the Great Depression and tragic losses in World War One, it pushed America into isolation. We didn't want to mess with Europe and thought they would only bring us pain and suffering. So we avoided any alliances with them, and isolationists advocated non-involvement in Europe and Asian conflicts and non-entanglement in international politics. And there's increased attention to domestic problems and our own problems within the country and how we can get better rather than how we can make the world better. We isolated self from troubling events to protect ourselves. And those are our references.